This is episode 74 of Michael Jackson's Dream Lives On, an academic conversation. Your hosts are academic Elizabeth Amisu, academic Karin Merx, and our guest is Dr. Tristan Cabello, historian at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. Let me briefly introduce you to Tristan. Tristan Cabello, PhD, History, Northwestern University, is a historian of minorities in the United States and France. He's a lecturer at Johns Hopkins University and Associate Director of the Master of the Liberal Arts. He regularly appears in the media to discuss race in American and French cultures and politics. A former Mellon Foundation Fellow, Dr. Cabello has presented 50-plus research papers at international and national academic conferences, including the American Historical Association, the Organization of American Historians, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and the American Culture Association. He has also given talks at American University, Johns Hopkins University, Rutgers University, the City University of New York, and the University of Chicago. Welcome, Tristan. We are honored
Karin.
to have you as our guest.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. And as I was telling you off camera, thank you both for the work that you're doing with the Michael Jackson Academic Studies. I mean, you have provided so many resources to us, but also you provided really what's even more important, that is a community, a space where we can actually talk about Michael in a serious way, in an academic way. And as you know, that's very rare in the academic world. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the work that you're doing.
Oh, it's all for love.
Yeah, and you're welcome. Okay, our premise for today is: how does Sylvia G. Martin, define Michael Jackson through the notion of his roots and subsequently roots? And we discuss her essay, The Roots and Roots of Michael Jackson. In her introduction, she refers to the history of slavery that shaped his identity, which are his roots, and him becoming one of the most iconic entertainers in the world through the roots. To what extent can you speak of Michael Jackson having an American identity?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and maybe I can just also briefly explain to the audience, what I do in my research and my teaching about Michael Jackson. And so I've been teaching about Michael Jackson. I'm not a formal researcher on Michael Jackson, but I do teach courses in African American studies and critical race theory about Michael, both at Johns Hopkins University, but also at my previous institution, American University. And so the courses that I teach are basically very much what Sylvia talks about in her article. I taught a course about the global politics of Michael Jackson, which was about not only the discourses that Michael created about globalism, but also the discourses that we projected onto him. And currently I'm teaching a course at Johns Hopkins about the Black politics of Michael Jackson. So very much about here again, the discourses that he created about race, and also the discourses that we were projecting onto him. And so that question about American identity is actually central to the course that I teach here at Johns Hopkins. And so, really, four things to say. I mean, there's no doubt, that Michael epitomized the American identity, especially the American dream. I mean, after all, that was a Black boy who grew up in poverty in Middle America, and who, through his hard work and his talent, became the #1 pop star in the US and globally. And we're going to talk a lot about also how politics actually used him as an example later on in the conversation. So there's no doubt that he was an example of what America is about, or the dominant discourses about America. But the flip side of this is that he always he was also providing a critical examination of the limitation of this American dream. For example, I mean, all of his career was shaped by those limitations. I mean, of course, the history of slavery, of course, the history of segregation, of course, the history of segregation in the music industry, but also the civil rights movement. And later on, you know, the racialization also of the music industry and how this actually limited him in the things that he could accomplish. And so this is why also I think that at some point in his career, and that's maybe the third point here that I want to talk about, um, he became much more focused on his global identity. I mean, there's a point in his career, let's say, you know, around 1991, 1992, right around Dangerous, where he doesn't even tour that much. I mean, he doesn't even tour anymore in the US. Actually, even to make a political statement, I think the only concert that he gives in the US after 1992 is in Hawaii, and so that's also, you know, almost like a symbol right there, you know. And so there's a point in his career where really uh, eh, he becomes global, and of course he produces those discourses in America on a global stage, but also distance himself from the US very much so. I mean, this is not even his focus anymore, and in the end, also uh, there's a complex interplay here, but it's very true that America rejected him at some point um, with the child molestation accusations, but even his art was not very welcome. Even the work that we do, that you guys do, is much more welcome in Europe than it is here in the US. I mean, I do teach a course on Michael Jackson. I think currently this is the only one in the US. There's not a lot of professors who actually talk about Michael Jackson, which is really, you know, a symbol, like a discourse about everything that was going on in America at the time and even now, which is, I mean, Michael is really a symbol of everything that was going on, and yet he's not actually studied. There's not a lot of academic production about Michael Jackson, contrary to, let's say, you know, somebody like Beyonce, somebody like Taylor Swift, or, you know, even the Beatles or Elvis. And so, yeah, it's there's really this ambivalence here in the US that, of course, he was an example of what it meant to be American, but at the same time, in the end, very much rejected by the system.
Yeah. Liz, your idea?
So powerful, such powerful statements. I have so many things to say because I agree with you wholeheartedly. Let's start off with thinking about this ambivalence, you know.
Yeah.
As academics, we've seen it, you know, we've seen it in the critical analysis, the critical survey of what there has been written about Michael Jackson compared to the ephemera, which we discussed, the tabloid junk.
Yeah.
That's just like, I just see it as like mountains and mountains of rubbish. And then you come to the rigorous academic, peer-reviewed journal articles, the academic books, and it's just tiny. So when you talk about that ambivalence, and then you compare it to someone like Taylor Swift, who recently had, I think, a symposium about her, an academic symposium. And there's someone like Beyonce, where there's like analysis, critical interest in her. And then there's just this disregard for Michael Jackson, which doesn't compare to the size of his, because there's two things we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the roots, which I love, which is all this sense of like the tree roots going into the ground, where the person comes from, their origin. We can talk about America, we can talk about African American culture, and we can talk about diaspora. I think we're going to talk a lot about diaspora today, and Afro-diasporic people. And then you've got the roots, which is like the global identity, the journey that Michael Jackson goes on. And the two things are kind of contrasted in this article. But I feel like the pivot on which it all stands is this ambivalence. It's like a seesaw. And on one side, you've got Michael Jackson's greatness, which we all know about, which we all understand. And on the other side, you've got this tiny amount of critical analysis that's been done on him. And I just really wanted to pick your brain, both of you, as to why you think that is. Some people have told me, oh, and we think it's a race thing. But if it's a race thing, then why did Michael Jackson become so successful in the first place? How did he manage to break those boundaries and break those barriers and cross those color lines? And some people have said it's a child star thing. I think Margot Jefferson has kind of intimated that it's to do with him being a child star. But he shouldn't have been able to be so successful as an adult star, as an adult.
Yeah, I mean,
So yeah.
You perfectly encapsulate the problem here. In the US, I cannot talk about the rest of the world. In the US, this is where I live and where I work and where I teach about Michael. I must say that first, the ambivalence of his identity is something that, or the pseudo ambivalence of his identity, or of his image, let's say, is something that is constantly talked about, something that constantly comes back, as if we had to psychoanalyze him, psychologize him, even though none of us actually knew him personally, and we cannot do that, right? But yes. We have to talk about this. This is all that we have to talk about. And two, the child molestation thing is still carrying a very, very heavy weight on the accusation, you know. It's still carrying. I mean, when I was teaching this course about Michael Jackson for the first time a couple of years ago, that was when this documentary, you know, came out, Finding Neverland,
Leaving Neverland,
Living Neverland, which, you know, was, to me, was all crap. I mean, it was absolutely amazingly poorly done. And so, but still, this is all that journalists or people who saw me, you know, in the news wanted to talk about. Oh, there's this guy who teaches about Michael Jackson. Let's talk about this, you know. But one point that I wanted to make, yeah, is in America, like this is really, I think, what's happening. It's very difficult to talk about Michael in a serious way, or even, I mean, I've encountered absolutely no problem teaching those courses, and students actually want to take them. They're always filled, and they're always full with students who actually want to talk about it, to talk about what Michael said. But in the meantime, Lisa, as you also know, there is indeed this. There is the ambivalence of the identity. There is the problem with the child molestation accusation. But at the same time, you know, I live in Harlem, and there's not a day where I don't hear Michael being played in the streets.
Yeah.
Right. So the thing is that, of course, there is something that makes the general public want to reject Michael. You know, I mean, in academia, I mean, it's very true that it's a very white dominated community field. I mean, but when you're here in the streets, or even, you know, in a very diverse crowd. I mean, it was Halloween just a couple of days ago, and of course we heard Thriller everywhere on the radio, everywhere in the streets. But here in Harlem, I have to tell you that there's not a day where I don't hear Michael being played, you know, just at the bodega, you know, down the street. And so all of that to say that, of course, there is this rejection, but it's impossible to reject him fully, because he has. It's absolutely impossible, because that would mean extracting such a huge part of the American entertainment history, music history, just history in general. That he's uncancelable, right? He cannot be canceled.
Yes.
That's canceling Michael Jackson is impossible. It's impossible because he changed the way we all just even think about those topics that we talk about. And I mean, while canceling Michael Jackson's music is absolutely an impossible thing. So you see, it's very different from you know, say a character like R. Kelly, who went through, you know, the same also who was guilty, contrary to Michael.
But
So it's
but coming back to his identity,
yeah.
I agree with what you both say, and trying to. The complexity is, I think, is also because the question came from the base of his roots, slavery, his ancestors, and so identity in that case is difficult because those people, his ancestors, were robbed from their names. They were robbed from everything they had.
Yeah.
They had no identity. But you start to live according to the land you live in. And so Michael Jackson, being born in America, in Gary, took that identity as a kid. And yet he was African. And that's what he always said. There is this weird thing, and we come later to that, also how politics groom certain people, and also journalists, when they groom them and they don't need them anymore, they get either assassinated or they get, like Michael Jackson, they try to cancel him. Mm-hmm. And that's just very, after I have seen and read a lot of things, I have a very strong feeling about that. We will touch upon that in coming questions. Yeah. But I think that him having an American identity, what is not something we decide. That's something he decided. And he clearly stepped away from it at one point. And we don't know. Yeah, well, we can guess what his reasons are, very much. But there's also a part that we do not know, which is, and apart from that, I think he felt himself African more than American. But born in America, he had to be also an American. I mean, he ate nuggets and he ate things, and he had his
fried chicken, the fried chicken rumor. Oh, Karin, that's funny. Can I speak to? I don't want to interrupt you, but can I speak to that Africanness? Because that African in African America, and it just reminded me of Remember the Time, you know, and the all black cast, and you know, the ancient Egypt, and it just reminded me of, like, when you talk about diaspora and you talk about Afro-diasporic people, then the history just goes way, way beyond slavery. Slavery is a narrative that I feel like has a very unique place in American culture, and it has a very unique place in UK culture as well, British culture, because it has to do with who had the power. So, you know, when we want to talk about philosophy, we go thousands of years ago. We go to Aristotle. But when we want to talk about Black heritage, we just go a few hundred years ago. We stop at slavery and we go, well, there it is. There you see who had the power. However, it goes beyond that to Black kings. It goes beyond that to, like, my father used to work in Sudan, and there's, like, the Sudanese have a history of Black royalty that goes back thousands of years. And they've done excavations and archaeological digs, and they've found Black kings that stretch back in history. And it's something that, because we talk about Michael Jackson as the king of pop, and I was just really thinking about what Tristan was saying about how he cannot be excised from Americana, from American culture. He's inextricable from Americanness. And I think that that's to do with the way he presented himself as an artist. That's something I think that came from later on in his career. I just think about history and the history album and how it was presented. And I think about something like Earth Song, which I don't think he even got a release in America, but went to #1 in the UK.
Mm.
Don't quote me on it. I have to double check. But I just find speaking to what both of you were saying about the history, the roots, and it going beyond slavery to African culture, to African royalty, to Michael Jackson as the king of pop, and to him as something that cannot be excised from American culture, because as the king of pop, he has subsequently subject to something like the body politic, where we would say that his body represents the kingdom. So when we talk about him as the king of pop, we think about where is his kingdom? Well, his kingdom was America. He was exiled from his kingdom, but essentially, if we think about him as the king of pop, the pop kingdom that we're talking about is American inherently. I think when I think about pop music, I think about the British invasion, of America. But I think apart from the Beatles and a few other bands, the pop craze was inherently American. And so I think that my last point is just that Michael Jackson is the king of pop. You've got something in there about the body politic and about his body representing America, and how this assumed anything that happened to Michael Jackson's body seemed to be everybody's business.
Yeah.
It was all over the papers, and I always think of that as something to do with the fact that he was the king, and that people were looking to him as a representative, as a physical representation of what America is.
Mm-hmm.
Can
Yeah,
we
and
can
also
we go can we go
Oh.
to the second question, because it follows up perfectly on what you just said. So what are your thoughts about the quote she gives, the seeming de-Africanization of Jackson's cosmetic surgeries amid the oppressive Eurocentric ideals and standards of a mostly white entertainment industry?
Yeah, that's a very important question here, and I was touching on that previously. I mean, here there's really two things. I'm always very cautious about uh, psychologizing and psychoanalyzing Michael Jackson. Uh, Michael Jackson is not somebody I knew. It's not somebody that any of us knew, and of course we can project, a ton of discourses onto him, but the fact is, what was really his relationship with America or with his African American identity, or why did he do so much, or so little? We don't know. Plastic surgery and so on and so forth is something that we will never know. But we know what he said, and what he said has been very straightforward. He's always said um, that he was proud to be African American. He always said that um, uh, the skin discoloration was due to a skin disease. He always said that he didn't even do that much plastic surgery. That most of the reason why his face changed was because he changed his diet, for example, and he became a vegetarian, in the late 80s. But this is somebody that was always, in the public eye, and so of course we scrutinize, his appearance all the time. But will we ever know why he acted a certain way? I don't think so. What's much more interesting to me is, as you were saying, Lisa, I mean, why were we so obsessed with him? Why were we so obsessed with the fact that he changed the way he looked? Why were we so obsessed with the fact that, he didn't look black, he didn't look white, he didn't look really, he was like this hybrid, vision of humankind, that 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 was, in the end, very much ahead of his time. And that was something that we struggled with as the public. But one thing that's very important here, I think, to note is, as his skin uh, looked whiter, as his features looked more Eurocentric. Um, I think his music and his videos and his art became more and more Afrocentric. And so the message that he was, really releasing onto the world was this message of I am proud to be African American. I mean, if you think of the Wall and Thriller, those are not I mean, they are, but those are not the most political albums of his career. But when you think about Dangerous and History, for example, those are really albums that have those political gems inside of them, you know, like They Don't Care About Us, like Earth Song, like Too Bad, like Jam, like Black or White, you know. And so it seems that there was uh, the media wanted to portray Michael as whiter and whiter, as more, you know, Eurocentric. Um, but when you listen to his music, when you watch his videos, when you watch his concerts, when you listen to what he was saying, I mean, you know, in the early 2000s when he was going against the major company, you know, that was all very political and that was very much oriented into, you know, some sort of a Black Power discourse, right? And so that's what's very interesting to me. It's the the disjunction that there was between the way the public saw him and what he was actually creating as discourses in his art.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
wow.
to me that's very interesting because no, we will never know.
Yeah.
It's not that's not up to us either. But as academic and as artist, I'm an art historian.
Yeah.
I can see that because if you look at his fans, a lot of them are white. And I see this in art too. If they have to paint someone of color, they have the tendency to paint them more white than they are. There is something, I don't know why that is, but that is the case. I've noticed this often. They have a difficulty with painting that specific skin color. And I don't say everyone, the people who really had a good education, they know what to do, but there is something in it. We see him as we want to see him. So we mirror ourselves on him. And because he was so in the public, I think there has never been an artist who was so worldwide known and loved as Michael Jackson. So everyone starts to project himself on him. And if you look at how he then changed himself, and Susan Fast writes about that also in her little book, Dangerous, where she says, where she writes about him changing and that he goes too quick and we can't keep up, something like that. Yeah, to me, that is someone who is walking the tightrope of art with a capital A and art with a normal A.
Yeah.
And that is the difficulty. But it's not up to us if what he did. That's totally his own doing, and we're not there to judge.
I agree.
You're muted, Liz.
Thank you, Karin. I think it's really important that we get over this concept that says Michael Jackson wanted to be white, or he became white, because he didn't. He didn't. He was born a Black man and he died a Black man. So that's you know, I always feel like I'll have to make that statement straight off the bat, and then go into this concept of analyzing this concept of the scrutiny and the scrutinizing of the appearance, which is something that started very early on in childhood with the Jackson 5 days, with puberty, and it's in Moonwalk. Michael Jackson talks quite clearly about people coming up to him and being disgusted by him because he had spots, or because he had become like maybe a gangly teenager, long arms, long legs, who didn't look like the cute little boy that sang Rockin' Robin and Ben. But then we have this thing about being Black. And I feel like being Black inherently politicizes things that shouldn't really be political. Doing something while Black, like performing while Black, masking while Black, or shopping in America while Black, can just doing anything being Black politicizes your actions. And I think that what Michael Jackson did was he really understood that concept of how being Black made his work political. And then he went to go and politicize himself in his work, which I think that this is just the magic of Michael Jackson, that he used that. He understood it, he grappled with it, and then he used it in his work.
Yeah.
Then we have that whole thing about gender. So we've got the race element, we've got the political element, and then we've got the gender element. I read somewhere that Michael Jackson turned from a Black man to a white woman. And I just thought that was so problematic. First of all, this concept of Black people wanting to be white has been around for hundreds of years in predominantly white Western culture. We have the phrase to wash the Ethiop white. We have early modern plays in which people like Ben Jonson, playwrights, national poets are writing for kings and queens in the mask of Blackness, the mask of beauty, that they can be African, be Black themselves up in blackface, and then wash the Blackness off and become white. Which
you
is
even have
what
the
they were all
climate
along.
theory. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you even have the climate theory, which is just ridiculous.
So we've got like this gender thing going on, which is a resistance to an aesthetic that Michael Jackson was going for, that he ascribed to throughout his career, which I think was beautiful. I always think Michael Jackson was beautiful throughout his career, and I think he was beautiful till the day he died. That's my personal opinion. And I know that it's actually shared by a lot of people, but that masculine Blackness and identity contrasted with an almost feminine beauty created a problem, created a tension for some people, which caused a resistance to the way Michael Jackson looked from, throughout his career, from Thriller onwards. So I don't think he was trying to ascribe to a Eurocentric version of beauty.
No.
I think he was trying to
no.
ascribe to a version of beauty that he could see, but I do not think that he was trying to be Eurocentric. I don't think that looks, when he passed away, was Eurocentric. I don't think he looked like a white person, and I don't think he was trying to look like a white person. But the fact that people claim that is a problem. Why would any Black person want to be white?
Because it's the other way around.
Yeah.
A lot of white people want to be brown.
Michael Jackson said it, didn't he? He said it in the Oprah Winfrey interview.
It's true. Look at the beaches.
Many white people go out into the sun to become other than what they are, to tan. And go on, Karin, go on, Tristan. Sorry.
No, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, like, that was it's absolutely obvious to me that Michael Jackson never wanted to be white. That's a discourse. That's a discourse that we just projected. We, not me, but the public projected, the media projected onto him. That says so much about, indeed, how this country. Because all this stuff, really came from, predominantly from America, from the UK. As I remember, I grew up in France, and that was not really something that we talked about on TV. Like the color of his skin, France has another problem with race, but the fact that we created, those discourses, says so much more about us as a society in America than it says about him. It says nothing about Michael, but it says everything about us. Why did we care? Why did we care? The fact that the color of his skin changed, the fact that the shape of his nose changed, the fact that indeed, like, he had feminine traits and very masculine traits.
We all have.
He had a high-pitched voice, and he had a very low-pitched voice, when he was speaking. And so why did we care about all of this? And I think that says really a lot about also what we were going through, at the time. We didn't talk, at the time, about gender, about sexuality, about race, the same way we conceptualize it today. You know, I mean, it's really it's a period of American history where really the news is dominated by AIDS at the time. There's really, you know, a culture wars. There's really, you know, really those controversies, you know, about sexuality, you know, are omnipresent. And as you said, Elizabeth, I mean, really the intersection, and here again, you know, intersection is not even a word that's actually coined at the time, you know.
No.
In 1988, you know, when Michael Jackson comes back with the Bad album and he looks vaguely different from what he looked like with Thriller, hey, it's the intersection of race, of gender, of sexuality, and the fact that he's a global icon, that he represents America somehow. This is what we think. That's becoming problematic. It was never just about race, just about gender, just about sex. It was about all of it together, I think.
And you
Yeah.
say something here, representing America. I don't think he represented America. You don't represent a country as when you're an artist, and a lot of them did, but they didn't know, and we come to that. But he was himself. He was an artist,
Yeah,
and
of
he
course,
was
of course.
constantly thinking about how he could do things, how he could change things, and you said he wasn't political before, but I think in Moonwalk, when he uses when at the end the South African group comes on stage in Moonwalker, that is very political.
Oh, okay.
That's very
Yeah.
political.
Ladies with Black Mambazo.
Yeah. That's very political.
And Karin, like I completely agree with you. Of course that he didn't represent anybody but himself. But what I'm much more interested in is, I think for many people in America, he did represent, you know, the US.
But then you come to what? Yeah.
And so because
I agree.
That's because you're much more of an artist than I am, and so I think that you see, you know, the artistic persona, like you coming from this artistic, you know, point of view, and that's very true, you know. And from an historian perspective, what I'm much more interested in, and so this is why when I'm saying like he represents, you know, America, is much more about you know, the discourses that were produced about Michael, you know. I mean, and so there was this thing, you know. I mean, of course he didn't represent, you know, the US, but this is also in many ways the way he was seen, you know, by many people.
I think, and I go ahead on what we come to an extent. People, artists, visual writers, represented America, but often didn't know, and it was the CIA who used them to make them propaganda in Europe, especially against Russia. And when Michael Jackson was in the 1980s, he became like the icon and the world icon. I bet it wasn't the CIA anymore. It was another organization who took over the funding of these kind of things. I wouldn't be surprised. In that respect, he did represent America.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
My argument has always been, I've wanted to write this essay for years about Michael Jackson and the body politic and Henry VIII. And just the way, you know, because I think you're right. I think you're both right. He was himself. He was an artist. That's it. But at the same time, he was a figure of an iconic figure of such symbolic power that I like to refer to him as the King of Pop a lot, because he did have the status, I believe, of a king. And I always think of who's the most iconic British king that we've had. So I always think of Henry VIII. And the way his body was seen to be representing of the kingdom. And the fact that, you know, he didn't have an heir for so long was a big problem for the kingdom. And I just feel like the way Michael Jackson was scrutinized and like picked apart and focused upon has a very strong relationship to kingship. And if you are the king of a country, then you are the country,
Mhm.
essentially. Because anything that happens wrong with you is wrong with the country. Into Shakespeare, because it's always fun to get in there. You look at things like Hamlet and Macbeth, and you say something is wrong in Hamlet in the state of Denmark, and then in Macbeth there's something wrong in Scotland, and the king has been murdered, and then everything deteriorates from that point onwards. I feel there's a lot of narratives around Michael Jackson which relate to his kingship, which is a very amorphous concept. It's very difficult to pin down
Yeah.
because he was just named the King of Pop by Elizabeth Taylor, wasn't he?
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's something in there. There's a point
Yeah.
to be made.
There's
Absolutely,
definitely an
but
article to
if
be
you-
written there.
Yeah, and if you know what kingdoms are, and we have a kingdom in the UK, we have one in the Netherlands, then you also know how that works and how they are profiled and put in front of the people through media.
Yeah.
Media is the vehicle
Yeah.
that represents them,
Yeah.
and they have to represent the country. So they're
Yeah.
scrutinized, and they are either up or they're down. It's really from the pedestal to the gutter. And can go in
Because you
1 week.
think about athletes, athletes representing their country, and like boxing, and Michael Jackson was very much like he liked the language of like athleticism. Because you have Black people in America have excelled in all areas, and they've excelled in athleticism and in sports and with music. I think the media focuses highly on those two areas, and so I think there is an overlap between music and sport. There's something in there between the virtuosity that it takes, the practice, the sportsmanship of. I feel like that Michael Jackson was like an athlete, the way he danced.
Of course, yeah.
So there's something there.
Yeah, okay. What are your thoughts about him wearing a military costume when with Reagan in 1984? Because I remember Lisa McDuff saying in one of the podcasts we did with her that he was just a puppet for the government. What are your thoughts about that? And was she right, or is it more complex?
Yeah, but that's a good question too, and it's probably, of course, much more complex than that. I mean, yes and no. So there were many things, many campaigns that politicians used Michael Jackson for. I remember, drunk driving, the war on drugs. And here I'm always a little bit ambivalent uh, about the role that Michael played. That was another question that you had, guys. Was he played or did he play them? I think it's both, really. It's very ambivalent. I mean, did Michael, when he was doing this, the first thing I think with Reagan, that was drunk driving, when he gave, I think, the song "Beat It" for an anti-drunk driving campaign. And then there was the war on drugs, But did he know that really the people who were criminalized, for those crimes were predominantly African American, were predominantly poor, that the war on drugs was nothing more than a way to socially control minorities in America. It was never about drugs. It was always about controlling Black people. Did he know that? Did he know when he does when he's at the Clinton inauguration, and he talks about AIDS, and of course he gives, the example of Ryan White. Did he know how gay people were actually also very much criminalized during those days, that they were not helped by the government, that Ryan White was the safe victim per se of AIDS? Was he really aware of that? I always come back here again, living in Harlem. I've met people who who are longtime Harlem residents, who were here when they shot Bad in 1986 or 1987, just literally 4 blocks away from where I live, and there's a plague there. And I remember Quincy Jones saying in his autobiography, I don't know if this is true, that Michael, asked him, do people really live here? That Michael was actually not aware that that was that the living conditions, of some people in America were that bad. And so, here, of course, that he used, those politicians to his own advantage. Of course, that Michael was soft power. Of course, that Michael, but he was also used in many ways by those politicians. Of course, that was so great, in 1984, 1983, where he was right there next to Reagan, and trying to give his voice to the anti-drunk driving campaign or the war on drugs. That was great. But he was absolutely, I think, of course, used by those politicians to really, put in shape politics and policies that were very much anti-Black.
Yeah.
And so here, there's really this ambivalence, but at the same time, because it's never really, it's never either Black or white with Michael, right? 1984, that's also 1983, 1984, that's also the moment where he's on tour with his brothers for the Victory Tour all over America. And that's also a political year for America. And what we know now is that there was a lot of connection between Joe Jackson, who was still a little bit involved in the Victory Tour, and Jesse Jackson, the politician, Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was also at the time seeking the nomination for the Democratic Party. He was part of the primaries. And what we know is that at the Victory Tour, there were voting registration tables organized, put there to make sure that the predominantly, African American crowd that was coming to see the Jacksons did register for voting, and that was organized by Jesse Jackson. There was a link right there. So, did Michael really know about this? I mean, in the end, it's not really. Again, like I come back to what I was saying. I mean, it doesn't really matter if he knew or if he didn't know. The fact is that it did happen. It did produce something. It did change, the way we think about him and the way and the discourses that he created. So it's never really, yeah, it's always much more complicated than it seems, on the surface, right?
Yeah, I have my ideas about that too, because he wears a military costume. And I have I always come back to Foucault. I love Michel Foucault.
Yeah.
I studied him. And so I don't think he was a puppet. They might have thought he was a puppet because that's what politics do. But I think he was a very subtle way to show a form of power. Because according to Foucault, power is a form of exercising uniformity, conformity, and social discipline in societies. And I think that is also what the politicians try to do. And it actively creates its subjects and objects rather than practicing sovereign and supreme control over society through an external medium, for example, figures of authority. And he says then that power is therefore internalized and by its subjects, and it's not some external form of control that takes its proliferation from a single source. So productive power inherently displays a control through instruments of discipline, such as education, social classes, etc. And it's also displayed through societal structures, such as families, economy, and even individuals who internalize these processes of discourse and abides by them as norms. Now, Michael Jackson doesn't wear a soldier's uniform, but a uniform of a man with status. And to me, when he stands there, it is a way that he exercised the power to be equal to Reagan, who is a president. And it gives the Black inhabitants of the US the feeling they are way more than they have given ever credit for. Because historically, they internalized that they had no power, but were merely instruments of those who had the power. And MJ shows otherwise. So, yeah, I think it's always complex. If he is completely aware of what you said, do people really live here? I always find that a bit questionable because he lived in Gary. And excuse me, that was not the big, in Hollywood, one of the big villas. It was a very small house where they had to live cramped up on top of each other. They didn't have much money. So he knew what being poor was. I think he was aware because he was born also in that time that Martin Luther King was fighting for the rights of Black people. And to me, this is a powerful statement of Michael Jackson. He's standing there and he shows himself way more than just one of those poor kids who is on drugs or whatever. Yes, they used him. He used them too. That's how I think about that. Liz?
Yeah, I think that is so fascinating. This concept of like Michael Jackson, whether he was being used by political parties or whether he could be used. I think fundamentally, I believe that he couldn't be used because he had too much controversy in his appearance, his actions, the way he was accused, the way he dressed, the way he spoke, the things he said, how they were articulated. Michael Jackson definitely had political leanings, but they weren't to political parties. If we look at something like the history teaser, you can see that is an artist that is politically minded. And then there's also this concept of like this game, because we talk about puppetry, and was Michael Jackson a puppet for political gain? And that game, I think, is epitomized by Jam, the song and the short film, to express, almost like this inarticulate joy, the ecstasy of communication that Michael Jackson experienced. It's a concept of like, he says it over and over again, it ain't too hard for me to jam. And the song is actually about, political issues. But the expression is almost like a joyful expression of inarticulate joy. And then you have the short film where it's Michael Jackson and Michael Jordan are like jamming. And, Michael Jordan is a hero, and Michael Jackson is also, an icon. And then there's all this thing, like they say, don't play a player, don't joke a joker, don't play a player. Michael Jackson, I feel like, is a lot more intelligent than a lot of people give him credit for. Yeah. Like I discussed his military jackets in Liberace Goes to War, undressing Michael Jackson's fashion in Dangerous Philosophies. But there's the word that Tristan used, which I thought was overarching, was control. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's about fundamentally, is the fact that, there were people who definitely thought they could control Michael Jackson and use him for their own aims. But if we look at the larger story, the overarching story of Michael Jackson, we can see that that's just not possible. That you can just take him and say, okay, he belongs to the Republican Party or he belongs to the Democratic Party. I think it's kind of it's very difficult to do that because he does have political leanings, but that's to do with being a human being. That's to do with things like we are the world. And that's to do with more of a global identity that we're discussing, and to do with the rights of the human being and obviously the rights of the child, which is where the accusations were so cruel. You know, I read somewhere, someone said it's as casually cruel as throwing a hangman's rope over the limb of a tree or something like that. And it was so cruel because Michael Jackson was very concerned politically with the welfare of children.
Yep.
And socially.
Yeah.
He had social political aims with his Heal the World charity. So he was political, but not in a way that could really be pinned down and used by a specific party at a specific time.
They might have tried,
yeah,
but it doesn't mean that that worked.
Yeah, totally.
So if they did this and tried to play that game, he had his own game.
Yeah. And also, I mean, let's be frank, you know, it was also a time where, in America at least, politics were not as polarized or as polarizing as they were now. I mean, there was no Trump, you know, for example, you know, so there was something that was very common, you know, in America and many countries over the world, you know, where indeed, as a global artist, you know, you go to support your president because he's the president of all Americans. And so it was not even support, it was just normal to do this, you know. So of course nowadays, this is not something that people do anymore, but that was also something that was very much in the air of the time, you know, at the time.
Okay, playing Thriller whilst congratulating SEALs with killing Osama bin Laden. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, that was very complicated for me, actually, because, you know, I mean, Thriller, as I said, you know, is played, you know, everywhere here for a number of reasons, you know, and there's always so much, you know, to that's put into a song that's you know, played like this in the moment of victory, in the moment of emotional release, you know. And so there's so much to be said, of course, about, you know, the zombies coming back from the cemetery, you know, and being revived, you know, thanks to the song. And how does that apply to this? But actually, I have to say, for this one question, I was actually more interested in hearing your point of view than sharing mine.
Okay.
Like that's actually not something that yeah.
Okay.
That was a very good question here. But really, yeah, my analysis like is lacking here. Like, I mean, I was very much more interested in hearing your point of view here.
Yeah, well, to me, this is definitely bad taste and a very bad choice. It is an issue the USA has to keep world hegemony. They groom people like Osama bin Laden, and when they are not functioning for their need anymore, they assassinate them. And as I said before, role of the CIA with artists, but also politics like Congo, 61, Indonesia, 65, Guatemala, 54, Cuba, 61, etc., etc. Even Khomeini is put into place in 79 in Iraq. So they fund groups for people for their benefit. And so playing Thriller blatantly shows the disrespect for Black artists like Michael Jackson. And then proudly showing that body goes beyond everything that I think it's inhumane and only shows how great America is. So no, despite Obama, who I think was one of the best presidents ever, no. You, Liz?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. It's not as far as I have the knowledge and the understanding of the situation. So I thought it was personally in bad taste to use Michael Jackson's Thriller. I thought the whole thing was in bad taste. You know, I like Obama a lot. I think he's my favorite American president for sure. And I remember the optimism with which the world was almost like flooded with when he was when he came to his presidency. It felt like it was like a Christmas spirit. You know, there was all over the globe. There was a lot of, and then in the UK especially, I was doing my teacher training, and we were just joyful at his becoming the president. But this contrast, what he stands for, and it's a problematic thing because Michael Jackson doesn't stand for violence in any way. So there's a big contrast in between what Michael Jackson stands for and what is being done by the commander in chief, or being allowed, or being, accepted. So I think that it's something I would like to hear more about and read more about. I think someone out there listening to us might write a lovely article on it, a brilliant essay, and it's something that I'm willing to discuss more when I have more knowledge and awareness of it.
Okay. Then I want to ask the last questions. What are your thoughts about the roots of Michael Jackson by Sylvia J. Martin?
Yeah. Just to come back briefly to what we were saying, before. So Michael died during the Obama presidency, and Obama released quite an ambivalent, statement when he died. But then to come back to also the previous question that we were discussing before, I think there's somebody who said something very important and very right about the state of race relations in America. It was the Reverend Sharpton who said there was an Obama, there was an Oprah Winfrey because there was a Michael Jackson before. Because all those white people became much more comfortable with going to see a black artist in concert thanks to Michael Jackson, and in the end, we're also much more comfortable voting for an African American president, and that lineage, right there, I think is important. So about the roots and the routes of Michael Jackson. Well, I mean, so of course that the roots very important, to ground him, even though he belonged to the world, in African culture, in American culture, in African American culture, and the routes. The rights, you see, I want to take, us as an example also of all of those routes. We come from very different backgrounds. We come from different countries. We have done, we all have different careers, here. And yet there is something, that that touched us about Michael Jackson. And in fact, if I talk about my own trajectory, which is totally pretentious, to talk about like how the routes of Michael Jackson have also transverse me, but it's also very true, and this is also something that needs to be talked about. I discovered Michael Jackson as a young kid, living in northeastern France, not the richest area in the country. And it's thanks to Michael Jackson. There were no books, my parents didn't go to school or anything like that. It's thanks to Michael Jackson that I discovered, and it's for many kids around the world that I discovered Motown. And then from Motown, I discovered the civil rights movement. And then from the civil rights movement, I discovered a whole bunch of history that, of course, was not taught in my schools, in the schools that I was going to. African American history, race in America, and by extension, race in other places of the world. And so, when we think about all of this, and there's a reason why I became a specialist, a historian of minorities and politics in America. And honestly, you can trace this back to Michael at some point, because it's his work, it's his art, it's him who also introduced me to a whole area of things that I had that I was not aware existed back in the days. And I have to tell you that you had another question that we cannot answer, today, about how Chinese people saw him. But what I want to say is that part of those roots is also the way that he's impacted us. And he has not just impacted us with his music or with his artistry. There were discourses that he created that generated, new discourses into us and out of us. And when we talk about race, when you talk about sexuality, when we talk about America, about politics, he has influenced us much more than we think, and deeper than we think. And this is also one of the very reasons why, because he has such an imprint on us, that he's not cancelable, right? I mean, he's always there. He's part of us, as much as we created him too, right? But I think it's important also to talk about, because we never hear about scholars talking about where this is really the origin of everything that has happened to me. Michael Jackson played a very important role in who I became 20 years later.
Liz?
I don't want to add anything to that. It was so good. It was so brilliant.
Well,
Our
coming
listeners are
from you,
gonna
that
be-
means a lot, Liz.
Our listeners are going to be so happy. Oh, that was brilliant. That was so fantastic, Tristan. I think thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's a
Karin,
pleasure.
Karin, do you have anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add. I think this is a very good note to end this beautiful podcast. Thank you so much, Tristan, for being
Thank
with
you,
us.
Karin. Thank you, Liz.
Yeah, thank you all for listening. And next month, another one.
So far.
Yeah.
It's all for love. Bye.
Bye, everybody.